So Dr. Bartle is an assistant professor at the Department of English in Concordia University. She was previously an assistant professor at East Carolina University. I've given you an introduction. We've started a little bit of a conversation, but I'm going to go ahead and let you start, talk about your work, and I think then you're going to jump into answering questions that we have a lot of in the audience. And could you tell us about your expertise in this field with Native people and DNA testing?
Absolutely. So 시험을 just 가봐야 되고 그래서 저도 지금은 시작하기. It's my honor and pleasure to Skype in and thank you all for your patience. My thanks to Nancy Fields and my thanks to the Museum of the Southeast American Indian and the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, as well as all of the interested members here today. So my training is in literary studies, so I may offer you guys a poem, but given that we lost so much time, I may not. And also in bioethics. And so that's how I come to DNA testing and Native American identities, as well as how genetics and genomics are useful when used by, for, and with Indigenous communities. And so thinking not just of us as being the subject of testing or the consumers of these tests, but what it means for us to take these tools into our own hands. So, traditional Genealogy territory, would also like to acknowledge the Lumbee down there and y'all's traditional stewardship of those lands, which of course have taken a toll in the last few years, honestly. I know it's hurricane after hurricane. So my training is from Duke University, as well as through partnership with communities and larger than community organizations. So through urban Native American communities, as well as the National Congress of American Indians. And now working to connect to the Kanika community of Genealogy. But I worked with a variety of community members, community leaders, and students through the Summer Internship for Indigenous Peoples and Genomics program that we've run in the United States since 2011, which has a primary focus on Ancestry. And we started it as well in Aotearoa, New Zealand in 2016, and just this past year in 2018 up here in Canada with slightly different foci. I hope that helps answer Nancy's kind of question. And I have some prepared statements to kind of walk through, but then I know you all have a number of questions. Is that perfect? And again, I'm sorry I could not be there with you all right now to work through this. So, to begin, and as mentioned, the recent high-profile case brought this into stark relief. Tribal citizenship is determined by tribal nations. No tribe uses genetic ancestry testing for citizenship determinations. However, parentage testing, which is another kind of DNA test or genetic test that looks exclusively at the biological parents of a given person, is used by many tribal nations. Tribal belonging, however, may be wider than or overlapping with citizenship, determined by tribal communities and includes adopting in, as well as belonging to ceremonial spaces, but can also be belonging to multiple people or communities, even within one tribal nation. And that has to do not just with the idea of rights to belonging, but the responsibilities one takes up and carries forth for those communities. Genetic ancestry testing has been growing in popularity as people seek to find out more about their family histories, part of what I know you are all gathered here today. Some of the gaps that occur in family history, either in stories or in, for example, paper documentation, though may have been choices on the parts of family members or acts of discriminatory institutions that were working through policies and people to eliminate Indigenous, Black, and other identities. While some engage in DNA testing as a kind of recreation, those for whom these gaps have been created approach this testing as a means to fill in those gaps, to recreate that history. However, it is quite important to recognize that this testing, while delivered in matter-of-fact percentages that have familiarity for those of us long practiced in calculating blood quantum, and in familiar labels of national or ethnic groups, the results are inferences. In other words, they are best guesses, not certainties. These guesses are based on comparison to reference databases, some of which are public and some of which are proprietary to a given company, including the data of their consumers. Therefore, different companies may come to different inferences about one's genetic ancestry based on their references for comparison. Further, the labels used are also matters of concern. As while the testing is known as quote-unquote ancestry testing, the comparisons are made with modern human populations. How peoples understood themselves in the past and how they understand themselves and construct their communities in more than biological ways today are not the same. However, this use of labeling assumes such parallelism. Recently, there has been concern around reference databases not including any American Indian samples. And so this refers to the Human Genome Diversity Project, HGDP-SEF public database, as well as the 1,000 Genomes database that are our largest public data reference databases. But that lack of samples is an intentional refusal on the part of communities, and it's also historically situated as a reaction to the Human Genome Diversity Project and not an anomaly. It's a protest that should be considered in relation to the testing. Why people did not want to be tested, why people did not want to be sampled, why people did not want to be included in a proprietary or public database. Further, the samples that are present from indigenous peoples in Central and South America, as well as Mexico, are not lesser than for coming from such peoples or inappropriate proxies, any more than any of the samples from indigenous peoples of the Americas would be inappropriate proxies for American Indians. In other words, the legacies of settler colonial efforts to exterminate peoples still has not eliminated relations that existed for millennia across these lands. So, to come back, the inferences that are made in genetic testing tend to utilize a notion of purity that may have little to no use when we are thinking outside of racialized identities. And by that I mean identities that have been scripted by racial science as different from one another and are separated from their relations. In fact, blood quantum and the percentages of report in genetic ancestry testing reflect this focus on an assumed purity in a potential past, or even for some in the present. So while a moment ago I attempted to address why different companies may report different results, it is also important to know why different results may be reported to individuals in a family. So why siblings may receive different percentages. Roughly, you inherit half of your DNA from each of your biological parents. However, you and your siblings do not necessarily inherit the same exact half from each parent due to aspects of recombination as the DNA combines to create you. Does that make sense? Yes. Solid. Another way to think at this point is that you cannot hold more than a small amount of the genes of each of your biological ancestors, as each generation means a recombined half is moving forward from each biological parent to the biological child. Right? So being able to sort of note this single nucleotide polymorphism, this SNP, or this other sort of fragment of DNA that is from my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, very hard to actually do. Does that make sense? Unless you actually had a sample from him. And then it would still be an inference to say you didn't receive it from any of your other ancestors. So, I hope this is all being clear, but I anticipate questions. Determinations of tribal belonging are made in various ways because most tribal belonging is tribal citizenship, and citizenship can occur through various methods, often through birth to a tribal member, but not exclusively. Native American identity is an umbrella term for tribally specific identifications. In other words, it is hard to understand yourself as Native American unless you have a specific people. And one cannot only say they are members of a community. Communities also have to claim the peoples. To reconnect, given the racialization of Native American/American Indian/Indigenous peoples in the lands currently known as the United States of America, a claim to Native American identity is a racial claim, not a claim to belonging in a sovereign nation or in relation to a community. Those would be different things. That said, one can clearly identify as, for example, Lumbee, but then go to Duke University and participate in the Native American Student Alliance. But that is a different sort of connection. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I ask this of my students a lot, so I love the feedback of the nodding heads.
Yes.
All right. So I'm trying to wrap up so again you can ask questions and honor your time. Given the gathering you were all at, and I am honored to speak to from a distance, there is a strong attention to genealogy. And I hope we can discuss your concerns or questions about how DNA as a piece of information can be made to connect with other research about how kinship, family, and connections to place have been made. I emphasize a piece of information as there is a promoted effort to elevate DNA testing and scientific reports above family stories and community knowledge, which to me is a failure of imagination and a very dangerous ceding of knowledge production to genetics and those who produce its inferences instead of tribal communities remaining in control of decisions. For example, there is a danger in requiring a DNA test even for parentage, particularly to say within communities that we do not know who the mother is biologically, and to limit the possibilities of parents to those who made biological contributions to the child, as opposed to those who are involved in their raising, education, and care and upbringing. If a DNA test discreetly makes those determinations, where is room for community and nation to disagree, to construct identity and belonging otherwise, and particularly to support our clear and two-spirit relations? So, Nancy had initially asked me to go on for 30 minutes, and with our technical issues, we kind of did. However, I know this topic generates myriad questions, and so I want to open up the floor to that conversation and discussion, and I'm sorry I missed the beginning part of it earlier, to build on what I've said here, to explain deeper some of the concepts as needed, to connect to what you have already learned today, and to what other areas you just still are questioning.
So I'm not sure if she can hear everybody in the audience, but do we want to re-ask the questions, or are there new questions from what she's talked about? I'm sorry I'm hiding behind the podium, but Mr. Schwartz.
Ask her if she has a database that she can trust.
Okay, one of the questions is, do you have a database that you can trust? And I'm assuming related to DNA and
That's correct.
that work, yes.
So I guess I'd have to ask Mr. Schwartz what exactly he's seeking to trust in the database. What sort of reliable information are you trying to get out?
Well, you want to find out if you're Indian or not, but you wouldn't know that unless you know that you're Indian in your heart.
Well, there you go. I think that was a rhetorical question. Yeah. And I think that that's really at the heart of what this session is about, is that what you have really put down in like the hardcore scientific terminology is that a DNA test cannot give you a measurement of how much Indian you are. That is dependent on factors such as community and connection and family and tradition and those types of things. And it also, with enrollment, yes.
Going to the community side, one of the features that I like about some of the DNA things are the family circles, your cousin matches. I've found more of the family names sitting in this room through that than I have going through census records and things like that. Could you talk a little bit about the cousin matches and family circles, that type of thing with DNA?
Sure, and again, what this is pulling on is, as you've seen, what is a highly likelihood that you are related to these individuals based on your genetics. So these would be biological relations that also took a test, and therefore the company can connect you. And companies realize, it's one thing to deliver a product where you get X results and then you never come back. But something like what consumers demanded of, well, what more can we do with this? How can we connect to people? Is really have started to deliver with attention to family circle with these cousins connections. And yet some of these sort of broader cousins may be so distantly related to you that you have stronger connection to your neighbors. And that's not a bad thing, right? That we have strong connections to our neighbors. It's again thinking about what is the kind of relationship you want to have. Is it biological, or is it one of attention, care, and responsibility, and how do we enact that? Does that make sense? And so I think it's a very valuable aspect that's emerged, and that people don't have to then focus on the percentages to gain a benefit for themselves.
Could you talk a little bit about, I know this isn't very scientific in terms of questions about the testing, but can you talk a little bit about advertising? Because the advertising seems to come across as very absolute. You're going to get a test in the mail, you're going to send it off, and they're going to tell you precisely who you are. So I think there's something about, I traded in my kilt for a lederhosen or something like that, and all of a sudden he's something else. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Right. And a few of us that are engaged in looking at genetic ancestry testing across a range of ethnicities look at this advertising as deeply problematic, in part because inherent to that promotion of find out who you really are, and even this ties not just to sort of the marketing of the testing, but how, for example, Henry Louis Gates Jr. created the African American Roots and Who Do You Think You Are shows, and these sort of reality shows that are investigatory genealogy and genetics further publicize it and show, even in general, even with all this genealogical information that people have with family stories, with what they know of themselves, with how they have been raised, how they've been socialized, when they get that genetic test and those, those percentages, which, by the way, can shift as their database shifts. When they get those percentages, they may throw what has been their identity for decades out the window, right? And this is in some ways promoted by these testing companies and by these shows, right? That the genetic test is the sort of trump card to all identity claims. And that's deeply problematic because, again, it's a set of inferences. It may be wrong, it may change. And what family stories have and offer may be much, in general, is much richer than simply the genetics. Does that make sense? And yeah, so again, it emphasizes the genetics as the defining way to understand identity, as opposed to a piece of information to understand your identity with, in relation to. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I think, well, we have in the audience, I'll get you next, Jana Roth, who is from Oklahoma, and she has a Lumbee connection through the Oxendines, but by virtue of the Delawares. And so one of the benefits, I think, of DNA testing for those of us that have done it, so it's not kind of like shame on us for doing DNA testing, but it does show family connections. So where, you know, the genetic makeup or the DNA, whatever, is changing, and I guess people are getting updates as the databases are changing. It's like, oh, we got it wrong, you're 10% more than you were, or this and that. It does show kinship connections.
Those cousin connections.
Those
That's what he
cousins.
was talking about with his cousin circles, and
Yeah.
it does show that. It comes up.
So they are valid in that way, yeah. Okay, you have a question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about, so through testing and through my own family research, I'm familiar with, through networking and seeing what the results are for a lot of Lumbees, you know, what their results are on tests like Ancestry, DNA, 23andMe, et cetera. And some of the other tribes that are related to the Lumbees in North Carolina, like the Waccamaw and Kahari, Hollywood, those types of tribes. But I'm not so much familiar with what are the other tribal members who are testing sort of up and down the Atlantic seaboard, Seminole, up to Wampanoag, and everything in between, you know, Cherokee. What are those tests looking like among those folks tested, who are testing? And then the other question I had, you know, is just in general, when you spoke about how the tribal organizations have shied away from participating in these databases, while the organizations have done that, us tribal, you know, members or descendants of tribal members have not. I personally am in the Ancestry DNA circle. My third great grandfather was Alan Lowry. There are 108 of us in the Alan Lowry DNA circle. A bunch of us are in the room right now. And that's 108 of us that paid $99 to Ancestry. And there's more than that, not just that one circle, but just in general, you know, it's like the membership is getting away from what the leadership is doing. So how do you reconcile all of that?
You got that right.
But you know, so that and what's going on up and down, you know, the rest of the East Coast with Native American tribes. What are those results looking like, in terms of native DNA and percentages?
So I'm not sure I can answer your first question in terms of what, I mean, various other tribes are definitely involved. As I said, they do parentage testing, but that's not full genetic testing. It's really just who's the mommy, who's the daddy. And so what sort of individual members' involvement has been will vary, and what their sort of tests are looking like in relation to this sort of like the old category of quote-unquote Native American DNA, I can't necessarily speak to, so I apologize for that. In terms of individuals versus leadership, the protest to the Human Genome Diversity Project and other public database sample gathering, and even some private database sample gathering, has been around how that relates to various kinds of extractive technologies and what is known as biocolonialism. And so this idea that, of course, we've all experienced colonialism, land dispossession, various kinds of bodily dispossession, and efforts to exterminate. But biocolonialism is a term to index efforts that are looking into indigenous bodies as well as the bodies of our flora and fauna in indigenous lands for medical information, for scientific information that is then used to benefit usually not indigenous peoples. And so that is why, in general, if you look at the HTTP-CEF map of where samples come from, which is, for example, the reference database that Cross was the month they used for the Elizabeth Warren DNA test, there are no samples that come from the United States because there was a general agreement not to participate. That said, there were samples from part of Canada, there were samples from part of Mexico, but limited. And there is even some concern that samples that were obtained from Indigenous peoples during that project, like samples that have been obtained in other research projects, were done in coercive or ways that did not provide full consent for how the biological samples would eventually be used. And it is that history of also biological samples being misused, being used, for example, in the Havasupai case, where the Havasupai, who are a tribe in within the Grand Canyon, the people of the blue-green water, they asked an academic to connect them to someone to help deal with their diabetes problem because they had about 50% of the community suffering from diabetes. And so the Pima had recently been diagnosed with a genetic anomaly, and so they thought, well, maybe this is something useful for our community. And so a geneticist came in and provided an inappropriately broad consent form and proceeded to find nothing out about diabetes, report nothing back to the community, but continue to use those samples for studies that included ones about schizophrenia, about human migration, about inbreeding that the community had not consented to, and which, as you can imagine from those descriptions, are fairly defamatory and discriminatory sorts of research. So that's sort of what that history has been and why leaderships have, and that's just one of many cases, why various tribal leaderships have said, for example, the Navajo Nation, which is currently renegotiating this, but in 2002 passed a moratorium on all genetic research. And so with the idea being that within the lands as well as with any Navajo Nation citizens, genetic research would not be done. So that leads us to individual choice. Of course, individuals can choose not to follow the policies laid out by their communities, and to my knowledge, the Lumbee haven't, come down in a moratorium way. So your choice and your connection to the 108 folk in the Adam Lauer DNA circle is entirely consistent with where your leadership may stand. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm just curious, so at what point, if we can do it where it's not an exploitative thing, so when do we reclaim our story? The scientists here and the people that have tested are here and would surely retest again if asked. So when can we do it in a way that benefits the community and test it and get results and analyze it in a way that, will help us, understand our genealogy and ancestry, how this community came together.
And I absolutely promote the sort of democratization and the control of the genetic resources by the communities, by the families, and at least that's what I'm hearing from what you're saying. And part of what makes that more powerful is actually gaining understanding of what these genetic tests are, what they do offer, and what the tools can offer as a piece of everything. And particularly, not just about ancestry, what genetic tests are useful for regarding our health, and understanding relations more broadly than even humans through that technology. But it relies upon Indigenous peoples as well becoming empowered and having capacity built to do the genetics ourselves.
Any other? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think identity and DNA testing are very different things. I mean, they kind of are intertwined, but I didn't grow up with a Native identity. I grew up as African American. I'm from the state of Indiana. I did DNA testing because there's lost history and lost memory, and I wanted to fill in the gaps. And what I found is that when I contacted my great uncle, who is 97 years old now, he told me that our family came from a Native American settlement in southern Indiana, which was very strange for me. But I did the genealogy research and it connected me back to this area. And when I did the DNA testing, it connected me back to this area because all of the people that are matching his DNA, which still has Native American ancestry in it, connect to probably a lot of you here. I know there's some people who directly connect to it. So I think it's very useful. It's like Luke was saying, you find these people in the circles that they help put people together who put their DNA into the database, and it connects you with all these people that you didn't know existed. It did for me. So I think for me, it's a very powerful story because it was lost information. And that's why I'm here today, because it's another identity for me, right? It's you know, culturally I grew up one way, but through DNA testing, I'm finding that I have other ancestral connections. So I came from Maryland to North Carolina to learn about what Lumbee is, who Lumbees are, Lumbee history, and this, you know, genealogy issue for you.
All right.
We're glad to have you. Thank you.
And that effort to learn, I am very admirable of, in that you're not just taking this information and as we were talking about with the marketing, there's this sort of quick turnover of, you know, I found out I'm more German, so I'm not as German. I traded in my Lederhosen for a kilt because I'm Scottish now. And so it's not just that claim, but and a sort of dressing up, but a seeking to understand, to find those connections, to do the research, to do the work, and to do the work of reconnecting, which Ancestry is a sort of catalyst for, but not a determinant of.
Any other? Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I had a quick question. It's not so much about percentage of that the test could do, but just based on your knowledge of reading what all these tests are capable of and the different processes they use and stuff like that, would it be possible for a tribe to maybe partner up with some sort of testing agency, not necessarily 23andMe or Ancestry, just some sort of database, and then try to test themselves against another tribe to see a relationship that maybe they have oral traditions of having a strong kinship with, for instance, the Lumbee, or very much kin to Kahiri and Walkamaw, and then just through, like I said, through genealogy, it appears, and again, even maybe somewhat through oral history, it appears that we are very much kin to some of the Virginian tribes. So I personally would have loved to have seen, or at least find out if it would be possible for the tribe to take ownership and partner up with, again, some of these other tribes to see if we do have this common connection that's still existent in our DNA. And again, not so much to get a percentage breakdown, but just to be able to show, yes, huge segments of your DNA are in common that would appear to be that there, again, are tribal relationships from long ago that are still, again, present and have proof in our DNA. Because if you were to take folks a random sampling of 100 Lumbees or 100 Pamunkeys or Chickahominies or whatever tribe from Virginia, they shouldn't be in common unless we do have, you know, a shared history. We shouldn't, because we don't have a recent history of intermarrying with them, for instance, like we do with the Kahiri or Walkamaw. So if that connection was there, it could be a strong asset to us to maybe then look and say, maybe we should be searching more genealogically or in historic records to see if we can find this connection, because clearly it's there. It's just we got to now seek it out. Would that be possible, is what I'm saying, with your knowledge of what all the testing capabilities are? Would it be more possible? Maybe not now, or maybe in the near future?
So that is somewhat a simple question.
I like the big ones. I like the
No. I think there was a lot of brilliance in it. And so one of the things I heard is the different kinds of questions that are being asked of the information available through genetics. And that is vital, right? This is, again, why I think it's important for tribal communities to gain and utilize the capacity to run these tests themselves. So if a tribal leadership, not in partnering with a company, because again, the company takes your data, right? So then they have 100 Lumbee and 100 Walkamaw Siouan, the data of all of them. And what they do with that is not necessarily within your consent anymore. However, if this is tribally run, you know the person and you know who is responsible for stewarding that data and asking what questions of it. including these questions of what sort of genealogical connections, what sort of past kinships may have existed that can speak to responsibilities to one another, alliances, possibilities to support each other and or perhaps to continue tensions with each other, because we know that our communities also have tensions. And so one, I think one of the most important things is if those sort of smart, different questions are going to be asked, that they be asked by a tribally run genetic testing company. And there are sort of nascent efforts within various tribes to create that sort of capacity. We have a number of Native American, and so I use the term just to encompass a number of different tribal affiliations, a Native American geneticist as well as bioethicists that can play into this. Of course, we know we have a lot of business people, right, real smart, and brilliant genealogists that could all come together and partner on such a project. The other thing I would encourage with this question is to remember as well, even as there may be genealogically demonstrable links between peoples, there is still the possibility that we make connections today. Our tribal nations are socio-political organizations, right? And I don't mean that in any sort of detrimental way. I mean that to think about that they haven't always been in the formation we see today, right? And so there may have been unions between the Pamunkey and the Waccamaw, or those peoples that are known by those names today in the past. And in the future, there could also be connections and unions, solidarities, revolutions led by those connections. Does that make sense?
Yes.
With genealogical connections or not?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
I have a question. It's not necessarily tribal related, but it's law enforcement. I'm from the state of Georgia. Everybody that enters the criminal justice system in the state of Georgia is DNA tested. What's the danger of that?
So I have a number of colleagues who have worked more directly on those forensic applications. My colleague Narbad Garrison and my colleague Jess Kolfinick have both worked in the United States and Canada on what are some of the issues around forensic DNA databases. Of course, we've seen benefits to this, right? We see the Golden State Killer in part caught because of their DNA testing. However, what this can also lead to is sort of your DNA was found at the scene of a crime, and now you're automatically a suspect. Guys, you know how many places you left your DNA today? And you know how likely one of those places may be a crime in the next, as long as your DNA is evident? And be clear, your DNA can be evident for various ways, particularly if your hair has a follicle and is left behind for a very long time. One of the other pieces of work I do is on our ancestors, and so ancient individuals maintain DNA for a very long time, and including there is research on things that we might never think about that contain our DNA that are left behind places such as what are known as coprolites, which are fossilized species. So this comes back to your DNA so it's one thing to be arrested, right? So if I caught your question right, when they're arrested, their DNA is taken.
Yes.
Okay, arrest does not mean conviction, right, y'all?
That's right.
Right.
Okay, so arrests happen. Arrests happen for protests, for water protection efforts. And then you're put into a database. And then you're potentially a suspect or your relative. What's important to remember too, as we talked about these cousin circles and connections, is that your DNA is not just yours. Your DNA is also your family's. And so this reference to the Golden State Killer, it's not his. right? It's a relation that they connect him through. And that has happened in various forensic cases around the world. That DNA found on the scene, there was in a database a relative. Does that make sense? Yes. So, you don't even have to be arrested. You're free and clear. No, the most boring FBI record in the world. That, I had to get it recently. That doesn't matter if your relatives have been arrested or for other reasons, such as, for example, like the military has an extremely large project around health, but getting a genetic database. And while sometimes these databases are used for ancestry and relational connections, other times they're used for health. So your DNA may be pulled for various reasons. You go for a test at the hospital. Where does it go from there? And so that's the Million Veterans Project. So 1 million veterans, genetics. And of course, this, as our communities are highly involved in the military, this is also pulling from our community's resources. Did that answer your questions here?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, we have to wrap it up. I think we could continue on and on and on with questions. This is absolutely fascinating. I think, do we feel better about DNA testing and kind of what they are and the information? I think we opened Pandora's box. We know more now than we did before this started. We know more now as it relates to when I asked the question, you know, was it just a novelty kind of thing, or what were you looking for? It's not your answer to Native identity. That's our big takeaway for this. So thank you, Dr. Bartle, for sharing all of your information. Thank you for making this work. I think that, you know, we had a little bit of a hiccup in technology, but this worked out beautifully, and we really appreciate you for Skyping in with us. So thank you. And I will be in touch with you soon.
Sounds good. And thank you all so much. Thank you for your wonderful questions. I hope that Nancy Fields has made my contact information available if you want to follow up with me, or I can connect you with other people who may be more beneficial for answering some of your questions as well.
Thank you. We'll have you here in person next year. Thank you.
Thank you.